Welcome, and today we will discuss what is probably the biggest imbroglio of our time. That is the class distinctions and class war, as we like to typify it, even though I'll illustrate why that's nonsense and boulder dash, and why actually it's much more likely we are living in what is a transformative, transvalued era around how we look at partisan issues. So in that, we will probably objurgate those lefties and progressives who still try to hold a distinction between capitalists and the, you could call them Bolsheviks or proletarians or peons or plebs or however you prefer. So to start with, and I think this is probably the best argument for why it's nonsense, is that Spengler wrote a treatise called Hour of Decision, whereby he related the trajectory and transformation of our modern democratic society, the idea that we're mob ruled in an anarchist, partisan anarchist way, and here's a controlled anarchism where we just go through motions habitually, even though the rule is actually not serene or absolute, but believed. It's just this level of power that we're assuming people have, but there's no actual definitional sovereignty or power to those positions, particularly when it comes to mob democratic rulings. So the first, I think, quote here by Spengler goes as follows: "There is very little to be gained out of the catchwords derived the way of thinking that prevails at the moment, such as Bolshevism, communism, class struggle, capitalism, socialism, each of which is believed by the user to convey the exact meaning of the problem simply because he is unable to see deep down into the facts. The same thing has occurred in all former cultures at the equivalent stage, little as we know of the details." Here he highlights a lot around Rome, so he draws equivalencies in Hour of Decision to how the Gracchus or the Gracchi brothers tried to institute popular reform and were killed for it, and then subsequently there were other reformers who tried to align themselves with the people, which then eventuated into Sulla, the first Caesar, and then Julius and Augustus, etc. So Octavian, sorry. So in that, we then can trace the exact same rhythm and morphological form. And to do that, we can dispel or disabuse hopefully yourself and anyone you know who still's holding on to these artifacts and antiquated, anachronistic labels and symbols. And you can see here there's been a load of, you would call it, political satire, cartoons, things that have attempted to display a power dynamic in a visual way. I'm a big believer in visual and symbolic gestures and art forms, but here obviously it's used in the negative or in the pejorative sense, particularly aimed at capitalism. So there has been a long storied history over the last 200 years of our society, Western Faustian society, pitting a capitalist versus a socialist as if this was a sensible war rather than what truly was the conflict, which was materialism versus, you could call it Platonism or positivism, things where there's more to life than just the material and the extant properties of materiality as a philosophy, as labeled by Marx. You can see here that here is a lovely illustration of how the capitalist system exploits the working class, the proletarian here, and then there's the bourgeois, and then there's the army who are fighting on behalf of the governors and the priestly classes who are being lorded over by the aristocracy. What is the judical class, I think, and then probably the other landed gentry or very high merchant class. And in such a display, there's a logic to it. The logic tries to convince us of its truth, more or less, where money rules all the way down. Now, this is only true if you believe it to be true, which sounds almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy to a degree. But if you consider in relation to how we've conceptualized political systems in that way, we have what is effectively capitalism as a evil robber baron with his nice top hat, and a lot of artistic leanings and representation here goes into this caricature of a capitalist looking like a greedy, usually fat man exploiting and or taking advantage of and or leveraging something in some way to better himself at the cost, at the pains of others. And so we understand how they've positioned this to be a zero-sum game, in that I get what you don't get, whereas we know from both classical economics and modern economics and any data-driven, every society which has functioned under capitalism has had uplift of everybody. So we've been able to increase the magnification, and the multiplier effect is positive. We are above 1x in terms of growth. It's not that if I get 2, you get 0, unless we share 1 each, then that's fair. It's more like if I'm rewarded for decisions and risks, then I might get 5. And if you're just there taking the order or you're being managed by me, then maybe you get 1.5x. But then the underlying nature of humanity is one of greed and jealousy to a large degree. And so this is what foments and then allows us to have this satirical system of governance, where we can clearly see that the communists are the happy ones, where everyone owns the product of their own labor in that regard. Whereas we discount that the management class has a form of labor. It just happens to be in here, and it's tacit, or it's at least not intangible. And because we place apparently little value, if we're a communist, on intangible things, we're very much materialists. And if you can't make it, then you shouldn't be rewarded. And if you're an inventor or an innovator or an entrepreneur, then you should also not be rewarded. In fact, you should probably be punished, and that's the communist thinking. Here we have a feudalistic system, which once again, the money is at the sword point of the knight, probably. You have a libertarian anarchism where at the cost of the blue. And now here they've done something with the colors. So I actually don't know why the reds are good here and then evil here. But anyway, maybe the underlying assumption here is that they actually are evil. And then socialism, it's a very confusing one. And then fascism, once again, I think the red are the bad guys. It's hard to say. I think the top hat, you're an evil person if you're wearing a top hat or any form of hat in a communist's mindset. In any case, I won't belabor the point too much here with this, but I think if we look at the data behind why it's such a ridiculous assumption, then we can see, and this is just using modern first world economies, like as in America, UK, Commonwealth countries, Western Germany, Scandinavian countries, things like that. So the first assumption is that there's a capital class, in that they own the capital and they take advantage of the worker class, the labor class. Traditionally, this was seen as blue-collar workers had a mindset and a collective mindset, political will, that was allowing them to ask for things like minimum wages, working conditions, fair rights, equality before the law, etc., etc. Opposite to them was the bourgeois, and you could call this the classical middle class and above, where there was landed gentry, but also business owners, and typically crony capitalists, people who were taking advantage of laborers. Maybe this was true in the 18th century, and it trails off quite significantly throughout the 19th, and you basically have it vanish in the 20th century for all intents and purposes by the 1950s, 60s. But the idea has stuck. It has been this carryover effect, and it's institutionalized itself as this system that should exist. There should be this labor versus capitalist classes, because we still see rich people and we still see the poor, burdened underclass, or so we think. when we look at political leanings, you would think that there would be a reflection between a labour class and a capitalist class. But what we get is that there's a fairly equal balance between your income and your voting record. So there isn't one class that we could define by capital, acquiring and hoarding. There are just as many millionaires, basically, as there are on both sides of the political fence. So the schema around how do we divvy up electoral and body politic is now no longer built on anything that resembles class. Class has, I'd say, significantly almost no relationship to it. Now, it's not that there aren't poor people and that you wouldn't win votes promising poor people things. It's that the identity of a poor person is no longer centered around their vocation and their unity towards a certain goal in that way. They just individually want more. And that's how we can see this, because anyone who's been in the workforce now basically has to have or has a pension or some superannuation scheme or a Roth IRA, some form of capital accumulation whereby it's employed in a way that generates more funds. So the most ardent socialist communists in America probably work in academics in universities or schools. It could be school teachers, whatever, but they'll all have pension plans. And so they'll actually be the capital class by definition. They will have capital and it will be employed in usually the equity and debt markets, in usury, but also in dividends, etc. So you are participating in the capitalist system. And that's not to say you can't change the system you participate in, but I think it's disingenuous and duplicitous to assume that you're not part of the class that you hate. That's the contradiction in terms there. And so I'll just allow for another Spengler quote to give us a bit more context here. This dictatorship is for the white races of today not a mere threat. We are already completely under its sway and moreover so submerged and so assured of its normality that we do not even notice it. The dictatorship of the proletariat, that is, of its profiteers, the trade unions and party officials of all tendencies, is an accomplished fact, whether governments are actually formed by them or, owing to the timidity of the bourgeoisie, are dominated by them. This condition was what Marius aimed at, but failed to obtain, owing to entire want of statesmanlike ability. But what he lacked his nephew Caesar possessed, and in full measure. He brought the terrible period of the revolution to an end by his form of dictatorship from above, which set the unlimited authority of a superior personality in the place of partisan anarchy. It was a form to which he gave his name for all time. His murder and its consequence could not affect it in any way. From his reign onward, the struggle is waged no longer for gold or to gratify class hatred, but solely for the possession of absolute power. So you can see this crystallization effect, where we have started to coalesce around this idea that the maelstrom, this chaotic maelstrom of power, how it interacts in and out of different types of people, some of them being politicians, some of them being bankers, financiers, some of them being corporate businessmen, some of them being lawyers, some of them being trade unionists. All of these people are no longer in the constellation, how we see it solidifying at the top, which is just in the power of one man. And that's why Trump has become a presage to this caesarism. You can see in him that he has the dictate and the will. Now, I think he's a beneficent leader in that way. He has a kind heart rather than a malicious one to the benefit of America. But in that way, where power starts to coalesce around the man rather than the party, rather than necessarily even an idea, this is what caesarism means. It's no longer a Republican Party. Trump has been elected as Trump. He's not Mitt Romney representing the Republicans. He's not Obama, a Democrat. He's just Trump. It doesn't matter what party he runs for. And this is how we get to the realm of caesarism. People will back a man for his ideas, regardless of what is assumed to be a class. You have just as many poor Appalachians who had probably incentives to go for a Democrat that might have given them higher tax credits, for instance, versus Trump, who may not give them anything, because the belief is now no longer a collective idea of we're on this class of subset of an economic function, but we're actually here by spirit, by blood, in a way that's now less definable along traditional lines. And I think if you needed more proof as to what I mean about this class aspect disappearing, is you have to have a conceptualization of who's your friend and who's your enemy. And if your enemy is capitalist when you're a proletariat, or you're a pleb, and you're against the equites or something where there's an aristocracy versus the underclasses, you have a fairly fair idea of who an enemy is in that regard. Now, who takes all of the work from the Trump voters, or who has Trump contrasted and polarized himself against? Well, it's against the immigrants, basically, who are more or less all illegal and or taking advantage of the system. And so he's positioned him and his party and his followers against that idea. Large corporatists, and he calls them communists or socialists, he uses derogatory terms to equip them as the enemy in that way. You can define your enemy and then you can group them together. And by giving them a name, you make it effective, particularly when you're building your own army, because you give them an opposition. This is how his vernacular has spurred on this idea of a rivet, a ribbon down the middle of American society. It's you're either on Trump's side or you're not. You're against him. Now, the against side, it happens to be Democrats at the moment, is incapable of actually producing a leader with any regards to fighting this. You have a very old form of American politics built throughout the 1800s, where you have hopefully a party progression, and there are these professional politicians trying to assume power and leadership, but because they're incapable of actually functioning in this new system, that you actually have to be charismatic and you have to be in a degree dogmatic and a demagogue for that reason. It's to say it's not enough to be a intellectual or to be an academic or to be a lawyer even. You need to be an agitator. You need to have that ability to be a protagonist. And they lack that. No one wants to vote for a Democrat because they're all nameless peons for a party system. They all fundraise in ways that's all collectivist with no identity, and no one can belong to the party. And they have purity spirals where if you're not part of this certain demographic, then you're no longer on the inside, you're on the outside, and being an outsider is an ill-favored feeling. Hence why you have this gravitation towards Trump, because he has open arms. As long as you accept him for him, you're welcome to be a soldier. And that's how he's started to form this idea of an army. And it's still obviously much more around the political version of an army rather than an armed forces to that degree. But I guarantee you, if you looked at voting patterns amongst the actual armed populace, and that could be soldiers and policemen as much as it is gun-toting Second Amendment profiteers, is to say that almost all of them will probably vote for Trump. So you have the strong appealing to the strong in that case, and that's the Faustian usage of might. And going forward, there will be different classes. You can always categorize people politically in a lot of ways, but I think you'll find an emphasis going forward on more obvious signs. So something like beauty or physical might and power, or technology enthusiasts versus Luddites. These will be the defining characteristics of a political force. You will have the martial aspect of not even a samurai class, but something similar to the warriors attributed to a Caesar, because a Caesar will always need to rule, have the physical power behind him. So in that way, I think this is a good place to go to the Spengler quote here, where he's saying, this is why armies and not parties are the future form of power. Unselfish, devoted armies such as Napoleon never possessed after Wagram. His old soldiers were reliable, not so his senior officers. And the value of any army depends in the first place on these. They came to regard him not as the commander, but as the perpetual giver. Once the required sacrifices outweigh the advantages, it was all up with the grand army. And this is how you can hopefully foresee the changes in politics is around this. We've gravitated less towards what is identity, and I don't mean identity politics in the modern sense, but around your identity towards your disposition towards a certain type of politics. So it's much more meta politics almost, where you have this regard for how the formations, the physiognomy of the political parties looks and why it's assuming its certain role and certain visage. This goes into the other type of enemy that I highlighted and alluded to earlier, which is that the immigrant. So now there's this natural internal discrimination, because when you have a mostly homogenous society and you introduce foreign elements into it very quickly, then you don't enable it to allow itself to be boiled like the frog. You have shocked it too quickly, too much, and in that you get a response, you get a reaction. The most common one is obviously xenophobia or bigotry to that degree, but obviously it's a very natural reaction because every society throughout history has reacted the same way. It is actually probably the admirable quality of tolerance to that degree, almost suicidal tolerance, that the Anglo possesses and the Faustian, the Teutonic man is possessed, to get to that degree without actually having any violent reprisal to any large degree. You could see it with the Irish, for instance, because they're Celtic and Gaelic breeders are a little more disposed towards acting reflexively with their not as much inhibitions, but they were able to, not civil war to a degree, but definitely fight against their colonization of Catholic and Protestantism, having quite a strong regard for their identity to that degree and fighting for it. And they would consider that a form of colonization, whereas the insidiousness of immigration is that you're called a racist specifically, not generally. So you can be against Protestantism as a Catholic and you can wage a holy war almost. But if you don't like a certain type of person, if it's an Asian or an African or a Middle Easterner, then you're actually specifically racist and you can't wage a war for that. So it's a very interesting dynamic that they've created around acceptability, what is acceptable to not like. And you can see here that it's not specific to Ireland, but it is specific to the West, that you have a general increase in immigration, and you can see this green line is the Canadian immigration, and obviously we understand Canada as one of the severe cases at the moment, and the blue and red lines here are housing stock, and it's generated and completed housing stock, and you can see the immigration obviously far outpaces housing. So every single Western country is going through a housing crisis. Do we wonder why? Not really, but I think we misattribute 90% of that to other factors around wealth, rather than probably ascribing it to what is effectively immigration. In Australia, you have a graph here of a population where you have a slight increase of an organic population, which I think can almost be attributed to migration as an effect of higher birth rates even. But in general, if you kept the red parts the same, you would also be able to keep your population in line with the housing stock. When you introduce what is this orange element, then your housing stock becomes worse. And you can see in Australian cities, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, that the population centres, because we're in this age of megalopolis, are all inundated with third worlders. And so when you get so many third worlders moving into your country, then you have this suppression of wages. And so most academic studies won't tell you, because it's not seen as particularly PC, but at the moment the indicatory factors are, and this is particularly for legal immigration, so if you also include illegal immigration and or black grey market workers, the suppression of wages effect is actually quite severe. You have and you would think a socialist or communist would be against immigration for this reason, because it harms the lowest in the food chain or economic food chain. Those at the bottom who struggle with having qualified and educated work opportunities will find themselves both unemployed, underemployed, and also lower, less paycheck basically when they account for all of these factors. And most of them, as you can see here, the natives which are affected is mostly dropouts and men. So men are the biggest losers here when it comes to immigration, because third worlders who come here, most of them are from patriarchal societies where their men work anyway, if they're not already just men migrating here from the third world. So you have a competition naturally for male-skewed jobs. This can be anything from manning a convenience store all the way through to garbage collecting, housing, construction, mines and mining, etc. So knowing this, and knowing the deleterious impact that immigration has on a society, just from a purely economic standpoint, you would think a communist or a socialist would probably oppose these things. And yet, because we don't actually have those class structures anymore, you have progressives, and progressives are people who want to be empathetic and suicidally empathetic to everybody. In every case, they'll put others' wants and needs above their own tribes, if you want to call it like that. And so in that, then they regard themselves as of one sympathetic mind. And this is where you get greenies, you get the mostly, I would say, middle-class civil servants and teachers, nurses, this very middle band of jobs who are not really affected as much by immigration. And if they are, it's positive in the sense that they individually encounter people who are at least somewhat educated and civilized to the degree of trying to integrate themselves into society. The people so the actual poor people who have been deprived, particularly this is the case in, I would say, the Anglosphere, Germany, and those countries who have a lot of MENAPT immigrants, is that you find yourself having to live in suburbs, which are now much more predominant by ethnicity. So certain ethnicities will move together and coagulate in that way, which corresponds to an uplift usually in discriminatory crimes, as well as a less feeling of social cohesion. And then the knock-on effects to that are also around localization of jobs and employment. So you'll have local businesses, particularly immigrant-started ones, only employing immigrants. They don't give an equality first mindset because they don't come from a place where they would bother to do that. You would just employ your cousin or your kids or your grandparent, whatever it would be. And so this effect, obviously, is a dissolving of the social contract to a large degree. No one was born into what was a functional society that has continued in the same degree and regard that it currently exists in. Because by the time you've come of age and you've gone into the workforce, what your parents experienced 20 years beforehand no longer exists as an environ. It's completely changed. And that's where you have this idea, I think, where it's satirical, that I think this is supposed to be Rupert Murdoch, who's lambasting this man here about he stole your cookie and you should be affronted by that and blame him when he has all the cookies down here or something. But that's just the relationship towards an unequal distribution of wealth, which is fairly normal. You would never get an equal distribution of anything basically in a society, because the rewards of a society are always skewed towards certain things. Like a king has always had more money than a pauper or a peasant for reasons that we might consider unfair. But if you removed the king, someone will replace him and still have as much treasure and material goods as the king before did. It doesn't matter what you call it. You could call it Joseph Stalin. You could call it whichever leader of whichever governmental system. If you see these silly little pictures down here, any one of the person who is in the power here, even the communist, the party leader, whoever's the leader is always going to have the fiscal imbalance. It's going to funnel up, as it always does. But it never necessitated such a breakdown of social cohesion before that you do get when you have the element of immigration, quite foreign immigration to that regard. You had probably the strongest sense of this in England when the Normans conquered, and they were completely different. They were similar to the Vikings, but they were not obviously similar enough to the local Anglo-Saxons, even though they're all gigantic tribes. And the Anglo-Saxons before then had displaced the Britons and the local Celts and all these other tribes, Picts. So you have what is effectively a new form of populace and people who come in and don't like and will never integrate into a society. They'll bring their own values, and you transpose those upon where you live. You don't assimilate. It's not natural. It's not human instinct to do that. It's to maintain a power dynamic is what you're basically searching for. Now, Spengler, maybe I'll hopefully not run too long here, but Spengler goes on to say, the world revolution, strong as it may be at the beginning, ends not in victory or defeat, but in resignation on the part of the forward-driven masses. Their ideals are not refuted, but merely become boring, and eventually no one can be excited about them. Anyone who talks about the end of the bourgeoisie writes himself down as still a proletarian, and the future is not for him. A non-bourgeois society can be maintained only by a terror, and only for a few years at that, for presently people are sick of it. And, incidentally, the labour leaders will meanwhile have become new bourgeois. This is not a process that appeals to the taste of true leader natures. And I think Spengler, obviously, the direction of the channel should give you an understanding as to how I feel about it, but nails it here, and succinctly too, because in the way that we can become bored, even of good things, if your society is so pleasant as, say, Sweden or Denmark or Iceland or Norway were for the last, say, from 1950 through to 2000, they become placid and you become docile, and you actually start to detest what is a utopia in that way, in that Thomas More descriptive. So you actually don't get a sense of progress being something good anymore, even though ostensibly you might intellectualize it as being good. You just don't feel it as if it's exciting you anymore. You want the conflict, and humans they abhor peace. Humans throughout history have not enjoyed peaceful times because it's not how we're engaged in struggle, and suffering is directed towards a conflict, and we enjoy the feeling of success. The psychological reward for overcoming an enemy is far grander than anything else in life, basically. Conan, the barbarian, knew this in his what would you like to see? And the defeat of your enemies was his number one answer, amongst other things. And so I think in this degree, we can just understand that the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades will have run its course, in the sense that the progressives and everyone who's pushing for acceptance, egalitarianism, will run out of good things for people to care about. There will be no regard for wanting everyone to be equal or wanting everyone to be uplifted, because it's boring and we're tired of it. And so you will get a Caesar, and he will spur you into a hopefully propitious and uplifting life, but you do have to make sure that you're living to the values, and these are those Faustian values I've talked about, where you're picking yourself as either this Teutonic knight or this Norse Viking, and then living into those values.